And now, the survival show that once survived, tweeting in all caps. In this ITRH Book Club episode, author Shelby Gallagher drops by. She shares with us how she crafted The Great Divide, thoughts on Glenn Tate, and how Portland might implode. Howdy and welcome to the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. This is episode number 265. I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Shelby, welcome to In the Rabbit Hole.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you letting me come and join you today.
Yeah, this is going to be fun because you are the first author of this season for the this round of book club episodes, and you are the author of A Great State. Now, we all want to hear about the book because it ties into another pretty popular book in the or author and series in there. But first, of course, this is a book club episode. One of the big things we get to do is get to know the author behind the book. So tell us a little bit, how did you end up in this genre? Was it something near and dear to your heart?
Yeah, it was. And how I kind of got started is like so many people out there, I'm a prepper. I believe in being ready for and being able to take care of yourself in any situation. And I started several years ago, kind of at a different angle than most. I started it as a single mom in the whole couponing world.
Oh, okay.
In the couponing world, one of the foundational sort of premises there is to stockpile things. When you find a super good deal on something, and I use an example in my book, barbecue sauce that I got for like a quarter a bottle several years ago. I bought like 25 bottles of them. Everyone in my family thought I was crazy, but that whole stockpiling and being prepared, and especially preparing with things that are non-perishable or easy to store, that lends itself really easy to being a prepper and being prepared for disaster. So prepping now is more not so much barbecue sauce, but more soup, canned items, things like that I can prepare for. So that's what got me started as a prepper.
Yeah, because I don't think you could live very long off barbecue sauce. I mean, it would be tasty, but I don't think you could do it for very long. How did that transition happen? Was it just something woke you up and you thought, I'm already stockpiling this stuff, but there's this whole other world that dovetails into stockpiling things? How did that work?
That's a great question. It was more the dovetailing effect, where I have all these things, and I'm feeding my family with it. We're able to kind of keep our budget under control better by doing that. But then it's like living in Oregon, especially, and if you live in the Pacific Northwest, about every few months, there's always something in the news about how there's going to be the big earthquake. You need earthquake preparedness. It's a big deal. Preparing for disaster, and how having just things on hand. And so I changed my focus of my stockpiling to stockpiling not just food and fun things because they're super on sale, but now stockpiling very intentionally. And then suddenly you find yourself being called a prepper. Now I'm stockpiling things like medical supplies or first aid supplies and water, extra water, and having a 3-4 day supply if there's a disaster. So then suddenly you're not couponing to just save money. You're now couponing for a disaster. And it was kind of a transition. And then suddenly you start meeting a few preppers in your community, and suddenly it becomes a very natural thing. And so I don't know if I can actually really pinpoint a time when I became a prepper. It's kind of was developed.
You just kind of grew into it, so to speak.
Exactly.
Okay. So writing, that's nothing to do with coupon necessarily. How did you get into writing? Is that something, what I usually find is people start off early, but some people it just happens late in life that they feel a calling to torture themselves by putting words on paper. How did that happen for you?
I've always been a good writer, and I typically, in especially my job and I've run a personal blog before and things like that. So writing, I actually like to do it. It's a great way to kind of just get thoughts and ideas on paper. But what happened, the events that got me to sit down and write this book series was first, it was about the fall of 2016. And again, I can't really put a date on it. It was just kind of the culture at the time in Oregon, the presidential election. I know all across the United States, all of us were watching this thing happen and just the craziness of it and how unsettling it is. In Oregon, it's very unsettling because we are already a very left-leaning state. And when President Trump was elected, there were immediately violent riots. And especially Portland, Oregon, already has a history of violent riots. When those were happening, lawlessness has always been allowed to happen. The Friday after the election, I'm not kidding, the freeway was closed down on a Friday afternoon with Friday afternoon traffic, and police allowed rioters onto the freeway so they could riot. That's what it's crazy when you see the police allow lawlessness to happen. And there's millions of dollars in damage to property and that sort of thing. So that sort of thing was happening and rumbling in that fall. At the same time, if you're living around that, it's very unsettling. Are these people going to come up my street? If I go to work, what's going to happen? But at the same time, and you'll see this in my book, there's this, the main character, her name is Julie. She bugs out to a family cabin in Colorado. And that is based on a true place. There was once a family cabin in Colorado. At the same time these riots were happening, though, in real life, that family cabin was sold.
Oh,
And for me personally, that had always been my bug out location. And here I am sitting in the fall of 2016 wondering, you ask yourself, am I going to bug out? I can't. There's nowhere to go now because that was sold. And so it was very unsettling and actually quite frightening. So that's when I put pen to paper. What would happen if I bugged out? What would that look like? And you just kind of take that small idea and you grow it. And it turned into a 3-book series. And here we are.
Oh, wow. That's quite a story. How did you deal with that? I mean, as much as you can say, of course, we all concern ourselves with OPSEC, but did that sort of light a fire under you to find a new bug out location, or to make other plans, or to network with other preppers in other areas? How did you resolve that, or have you?
Good question. Yeah, yes, I have resolved that. First of all, already at the time, I can very effectively defend myself personally. So if anyone is going to come towards me or take a step towards me and my family, I don't worry about that. But yeah, the bug out location has been resolved, so don't need to worry about Shelby anymore. And yeah, and what came out of that too was also extra prepping. It's interesting. Oregon has not got a great prepping network. I know around the country there's other ones, but in Washington State there are some great groups, especially in Eastern Washington, that I've been able to connect with and learn things like true first aid, how to do sutures, how to stop bleeding, not just band-aids sort of a thing. I've learned more agricultural sorts of skills. One of my goals this year, I don't know if it's going to happen, has been learning how to do butchery and things like that. So yeah, it's helped me to connect more with fellow preppers and find some of the resources I can do in an urban environment to prep. But prepping is very different in an urban environment than a rural environment. In the rural communities, you have a lot of natural resources, and you don't have the security problems. If you live in a city and you're prepping, almost your first thing needs to be, what are you going to do to protect your fortress, and what are you going to do to protect your domain and make sure you do have a bug out location. If you live in a rural community, you really can be your own bug out location. So those sorts of things have been what I've been working on since I started writing.
Okay. All right. Let's take a quick break for this vital message. Listener, do you get at least $3 a month worth of value out of ITRH? You should see what we do for the Roving Horde Armada members. Check it out today by visiting ITRH.net. Members receive access to the private ITRH Armada Slack group, where they get to connect, ask questions, get the news, escape the nonsense in their social media feeds, and shenanigans. Twice a month, members get together on a private virtual roundtable. We discuss guns, meat, news that matters, and other things you just can't talk about with anybody else. Access to members-only content and every episode ever produced. And that's just to name a few things you get with your membership when you sign up through ITRH.net. In the Rabbit Hole is mostly kept on the air and supported by members just like you. Go to ITRH.net to find out more and become part of the Roving Horde Armada. Now, back to today's guest. So going back to writing for a second, who would you say are the authors that inspire you, and that maybe you either model your writer's voice after, or your prose, or what? Who do you take inspiration from?
My inspiration, honestly, comes from Glenn Tate, and he wrote the foreword to the first of my series. And my series is called A Great State. The first book is called The Divide, and he wrote the foreword and describes how I sent to him the first few chapters of The Divide, and he really enjoyed it. And my voice comes from myself. Julie is a very, very fictionalized version of me. And I find that those are the stories people like. People like the personal stories and how they can relate to them. So if you look at some of the feedback that people have left on the Amazon copy or the Audible copy of my books, that's what their number one. Thank you so much. From a woman's perspective, a realistic view of what prepping is like and what a collapse could look like.
Yeah, there's not nearly enough women, especially vocal women, in the community, and that's great that you've added your voice to it, because it is something sorely lacking in the community overall. What would you say, besides Glenn Tate's book, what would you say are some of your favorite prepper books?
Prepper fiction. So you just changed a little bit. I would say Lisa Akers, great, great. There's also I'm forgetting Rawls. I'm forgetting the rest of his name. I just know him as
James
Rawls.
Wesley
But
Rawls, yeah.
yeah, there's some amazing, amazing writers out there, and they all have a different flavor and a different flow, which is great.
Well, very cool. So when you're writing, are you just trying to tell a story with a deep message in it that you're passionate about, or are you trying to really share lessons? And the best way to do that is through story.
I'm going to say both.
Okay.
I would say in my first book, I definitely shared a few lessons. One of them being how I use coupons to prep. I use that in my first book. In my second and third books, the overall message, and the message that I really wanted to share from day one, is I see a collapse happen, and I see the political groundwork that is being laid, especially in Oregon, and that's where a lot of this takes place in my books. I see a huge potential for human tragedy. We have a state that I'll use this as one of the ways that I demonstrate this. In the state of Oregon is known as being the number one state for human trafficking already, even not being in a collapse. It is known for its underground pornography industry and for human trafficking. It just
That's
is,
wild.
and there's a political reason
that's
for that.
wild.
And then the next part of that is that in a collapse, we know from looking at countries like Venezuela or South America or Bosnia, when there's a collapse, human trafficking has a huge uptick, because that's when families cannot use money to buy food, they will use other means to feed their families. I see in Oregon, when we have a huge population, huge demographic of women and children on state subsidies for welfare cards and that sort of a thing. And we have already got a great infrastructure in place for human trafficking. When Oregon falls, and I think it will, there is a huge, huge human tragedy that will happen. We will find women selling their children and themselves to feed themselves. It will be incredibly tragic. That is the overall message. And when we think about a collapse, that's what we as preppers, I think that's the message we can send. Look, women in that single women, single mom category, you have an opportunity now to prep for yourself and your kids so that you don't have to make those difficult decisions.
Wow, that's some heavy stuff. I wasn't expecting us to go there. That's
It is.
something that, and you're right, it's not something that gets touched on enough in the prepper community as a whole, and in prepper fiction. The issues around human trafficking and people selling themselves and selling their children is something that really does happen in collapsed areas, and it's not something I think people think enough about or plan for enough around. So walk us, we've whet everybody's appetite here. Walk us into the book a little bit. How does it begin?
It begins with kind of two or three different sparks that cause the collapse. The first being the economic climate of Oregon. Oregon right now is functionally in the red. It really isn't tax-wise. Revenue-wise, it does fine. The problem is that we have a system that taxes everyone to a crazy amount. So there's already kind of sketchy finances. I'm just going to leave it at that. Then we also have probably what we've all seen across many states. There's been some of it in the news recently about how the mismanagement of federal forests are causing these huge uptick in these really hot fires. So I use an urban fire to cause kind of and coupled with the economic collapse and the mismanagement to be what causes the collapse. What's interesting, I will say this: I wrote that based upon an urban fire that happened in Colorado Springs. If you go
Hmm.
look it up, you can see it. About 4 or 5 years ago, there was a fire that was swept through a neighborhood in Colorado Springs and took out a few hundred homes. It was very devastating. And I knew people there at the time that were affected by it and how scary that was. I wrote this book before the big fires that happened in California last year that we all saw the footage were just whole neighborhoods and people trying to escape from those fires. So what's interesting though is that you don't hear about those thousands and thousands and thousands of people that lost their home in California a year ago. The after collapse you never hear about. So I kind of use a little bit of a natural-ish disaster fueled by mismanagement along with economics, and I think that's very possible.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's a pretty good combination, and a scary one at that. That's interesting about the mismanagement. I know this is totally a totally a rabbit hole to go down. But what is the forest mismanagement a little bit? What are they doing?
Well, here in Oregon, and again, all I know is what I live in. Here in
Mm,
Oregon, what happens, and it's been going on since the early '90s. Oregon was founded, and its economy was grown on the logging industry. We have the most amazing forests here, and they're beautiful and they're great. And an environmentalist movement came in the early '90s and really shut it down through political influence. And I'm really truncating this and keeping it very short. If you lived here at the time, you saw it happen, and really. The federal government and the state was complicit to it, came in and basically really put a huge damper on commercial logging. It's funny. I talked to somebody in the timber industry who has a timber mill. There's very few left here in Oregon. Who said, what's really sad is I'm standing here in this forest with all these wonderful, great trees that need to be harvested for timber, but I bring my timber in from China. That's what's sad is that there's timber all around me and I'm starving and I have to import lumber. Trees are a harvest. They need to be harvested. And if you don't harvest them, now that about over half of Oregon is managed by the federal government, they're not harvested, they go bad and they get diseased. You have dead lumber laying on the ground, you have attrition. If that's not harvested, what happens is you have all this fuel on the ground.
mm,
And when it burns hot and it burns fierce. And because the federal government isn't there to take care of it, they come in and they basically fight the fire from an attitude and from a point of view of we're here to save structures. Well, unfortunately, many
mm,
of those forests, they have people who are ranchers. Those forests right there, they've just lost all of their ranching industry and things like that. And that's where that's kind of what happened with the Hammonds. We all remember the Hammonds. I know you don't want to get political about that, but that's what it was. He's trying to stop a forest fire with a backfire on federal lands, and he got into crosshairs with the federal government. So
mm.
it's that's what because it's mismanaged and not logged. We have really poorly managed forests, and we have an entire industry that's gone to waste. We have people who can't make a living, and timber jobs were some of the best jobs in the country. At one, you could feed a family and support a family on a timber job.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Okay, all right. What? How would you say writing these books has changed your perspective or your own preparedness? I know a lot of just reading and just in writing in general, you have to spend so much time and headspace there that it can often take you down rabbit holes, so to speak, and change the way you think about things or change the way you do things. Did that happen for you?
It did a little bit. And what I do is I find my time torn. I want to write. At the same time, my cherry tree is full of cherries and I need to harvest them. I want to prep, but I've got to get this work done. But what's interesting right now, I've gone back, I've done the writing, I'm going back and editing some parts right now. And what I find myself thinking is, okay, I got that down. Now I find myself, I need to get better at comms. I need to get better and I set little goals for myself. Here's the thing I think all of us need to know as preppers. You can't do it all. You
Right.
really cannot do it all. But as I think, I'm always thinking about what can I strengthen and what can I shore up that will make it easier or more that if I get some radios going here in my personal stash, Does it make it easier for me to be in communication with my community? So I'm always looking for ways to improve. And you have to make a list. Otherwise, you're going to overwhelm yourself. But yes, it's hard to write and prep at the same time. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. It gives you too many ideas and too many things where you're like, oh, I need to do this next. I feel that same way doing this show. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. So getting into our lightning round of questions, what would you say your prepper author pet peeve is? What misconception or thing that gets repeated in the community would you say just grates on your nerve? You're like, it's wrong. Stop doing that.
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say the misconception that all preppers are wear camo and carry 2 ARs and drive in some sort of a tactical vehicle that looks like a Hummer crossed with a Jeep.
Yeah,
that's not a prepper by any stretch. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this show tends to be a pretty good example of that's not what most preppers are really like. That's a good one, though. What would you say is your long gun of choice? Speaking of ARs in each hand, what would you say is your long gun of choice? Are you an AR person, a shotgun person, an AK, or something more exotic?
Well, I will tell you, yes. What I honestly, I'm really like, I like basic things that a lot of people have, so that I can pick up someone else's firearm that's similar and use it, and vice versa. I'm an AR shotgun gal. That's me.
You. Okay.
And for rifles, yes.
What would you say is your most important piece of prepper gear? Like one thing, what is it?
Water. Some sort of water filtration.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is the best $100 you've ever spent while in prep or on prep?
Let me think. I would say, here we go. A full basic supply of canning supplies. Everything you need to can. I would say the jars, the pots, all of that you need to can. If you can do that, you can keep a food supply going for a long time.
That's a good one. Someone decides, they listen to this episode, they buy your book, they decide, this Shelby Gallagher, she is my brand of wacky. How do they connect with you? Where should they go to consume all that is Shelby Gallagher?
Oh, wonderful. I would go to my website. It's agreatstate.com. And that's where you can launch off and see I have some basic recipes there now. You can connect with me on social media. You can see links to buy my books, both in print and on Audible. It's kind of the launching point for all the ways you want to connect with me.
Fantastic. Thank you for having a website. Too few authors have a website. They just throw up a Facebook page or something silly. So that's great. When, and we've touched on this a few times, that there is a series and you've got book 2 is coming out. And that's going to be really exciting. And I know how the launch dates of those go. How long till we also get book 3? So, and I guess that's the other question too. Are you going to stop this at just 3 books, or are you going to keep going and just keep going until you're out of words?
I will say this: I'm finding book 3 is not out yet. I'm not sure when. To be honest with you, I need to keep having discussions with the publisher. I will say this: I know when this episode that we're talking about right now is going to be aired, and if book 2 isn't out, it's doggone close, and that's where we're at with that. So this is definitely a 3-book series. However, ideas never stop. I've already had a few ideas as I've worked through this that there could be more. So this may not be the end, but this series is. I'm not going to change my mind. It's suddenly going to become a 6-book series. No, this is a 3-book series. There's a start and a finish. I need those ideas to find their finality. But yeah, I find myself though going off into different rabbit holes. So who knows? There could be more in the future.
Well, very cool. So lots of fun there. Tell us again what the website address was.
The website is agreatstate.com.
Awesome. Shelby, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing more about you, which so few people actually get to really find out who the author is behind the book. And then, of course, more about your book.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me today.
Get more survival goodness and help support the show. Visit ITRH.net to become part of the Roving Horde Armada. It's members just like you that really help keep the lights on. Again, visit ITRH.net. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to do all the YouTube stuff. Like this video, subscribe, and poke that bell because bananas are yellow. Show notes, links to Shelby, and other tantalizing resources can be found by going to intherabbithole.com/E265. With that, we wrap up episode number 265 from the Lone Star State. Till next time, stay safe and sound.